My name is Subha Ramanathan, and I am the manager of the partnerships and programs with Share the Road Cycling Coalition. Today, you're going to learn all about the updates to the Ontario Traffic Manual Book 18 on cycling facilities. And this session, in turn, will help you to engineer your community to be more bicycle friendly. We have two guest speakers today, and I will be facilitating the session. On that note, if you have any questions as you're listening to our presenters, please type it into the chat box and include what municipality or community you represent. We have reserved plenty of time for questions at the end of the session, and a recording of the webinar and copy of the slides will be posted to our website by the beginning of next week. So today you'll first hear from Dave McLaughlin, who is the principal of WSP and the manager of the firm's National Active Transportation, Complete Streets, and Micro-Mobility practice. He is a registered professional planner in Ontario and has over 29 years of experience in the transportation and land use planning fields. Dave is also a member of the board of directors of Share the Road and is co-author of several complete street design guideline manuals, as well as Ontario Traffic Manual Book 18, Cycling Facilities, that was first published in 2013 and recently updated in 2021. And he was the project lead on that update. He's also recently co-authored a white paper on e-bikes, e-scooters, and micro-mobility. Following Dave's presentation, you'll hear from Shawn Smith, who is a senior project manager and professional engineer in WSP's Active Transportation and Complete Streets Center of Excellence, working to create active, healthy communities. Shawn has 19 years of experience leading sustainable mobility at the provincial and municipal levels of government and private sector. Shawn's also author of Happy Trails, biking and hiking adventures in the Greater Toronto Area. He lives in Ottawa and can often be found exploring the outdoors with his wife and 3 kids. So welcome today, Dave and Shawn, and I will let you take it away with the slides, Shawn.
Thanks, Subha. I think you have to stop sharing so I could share my screen.
Yes.
Okay, great. Share. Is that working? Do you see my screen?
That's perfect.
Okay, great. Take it away, Dave.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Subha, and thank you everyone for joining Shawn and I. Shawn and I are tag teaming on the presentation. And thank you for your interest in the update to Ontario Traffic Manual Book 18. WSP developed this project in association with Alta Planning Design and Share the Road had a role. TNS and Marnie Peters and co. Marnie's an accessibility specialist. So it was a great team with a lot of different stakeholders that, provided valuable input. So this is not just a consultant-led study, it's a update to guidelines that was provided by all the municipal reps who participated. So next slide. So the OTM series is a number of traffic manuals related to different elements of traffic planning and design. OTM Book 18, the one in the bottom in the green, was the original one published in 2013, and the one to the top, even though it says February, it's actually going to be the fall of 2021 as the new OTM Book 18. Next slide. So the contributors on the left, I already mentioned. You'll see a list of our team members, all of them who had key roles in developing the OTM Book 18. Next. Our technical committee, and I mentioned this earlier, I think it's important to know reps from all these municipalities were very, very active in both the initial research exercise where we researched new areas of planning and design that thought should be included in the new OTM Book 18, and also in the development and review of each chapter of Book 18. So this was a very hands-on committee. Many of the people on this list, I would say the vast majority of them, contributed significant time and effort to the development of these guidelines. Next. So in terms of what's in it, the structure or sections are to the left. As you can see, we have a general information section. We talk about design users. We talk about the network planning process. We introduce and talk about bicycle facility design, facility selection, There's some changes there in terms of thresholds for facility types we'll get into shortly. There's a greater focus on design solutions at intersections and crossings. We've added some additional components to the other facility design treatments, including at transit stops. There's a section on implementation, which is sometimes the challenge, to provide some guidance to municipalities on a process for implementation, support features as well, maintenance strategies, which is a really important component. As you all know, the minimum maintenance standards for Ontario were updated a number of years ago that now include bike facilities, so that's an important consideration. Then there's a glossary, an appendix on signage, and a section on pavement markings. So the evolution of OTM Book 18 is very similar to what you've all experienced. Early on, we were mostly focused on getting bike facilities, primarily bike lanes and multi-use pathways. Early on, that significantly moved to more dedicated and physically separated bike facilities, buffered bike lanes, protected intersections. So the new OTM Book 18 really builds upon that trend and incorporates new design guidelines to give municipalities the tools to assist them in making decisions and implementing these types of facilities. So the general information section, if you can move on, really talks about design users. It talks about various details about cycling that needs to be considered. Design users is all about all ages and abilities. Next. So we talk about the actual cycling operating space. I don't think this is really that different from the original one, even though we're taking into account cargo bikes and bicycles with trailers in a little bit more focused way in these guidelines. The design cyclist has changed a little bit. It's always a challenge when we design cycling infrastructure at a municipal level. You really want it to be ideally appealing to the majority of the population. But the reality is, people are not super comfortable with bike lanes on multi-lane roads, and you're lucky if you get out to 5 to 9% of the population. We really, in this guide, are reaching for the interested but concerned, which is basically 50 to 60% of the population who we want to encourage to cycle more. We want to provide better facilities for them, better separation, or at least buffered facilities, and ideally much better information, guidance, and markings at intersections to guide them, and also to allow all road users to understand, who will likely be where along the road system, both traveling and crossing at intersections and driveways. Next. So network planning, if you can go to the next slide, is really an exercise about thinking about route selection and facilities. There's a process in the OTM Book 18 to provide some guidance. We integrate complete streets for the first time in this manual. The principle that when municipalities plan to rehab or redesign their streets, that's a time to think about all users, both pedestrians, cyclists, transit, cars, and also the infrastructure below. So it's important to provide that integration with pedestrians and cyclists sort of first, with transit, and then commercial vehicles after that. So that's the little icon on the top right, trying to impress upon everyone that when we design these streets, we need to design them for people first, and especially for the most vulnerable road users. Next. So network development, in OTM Book 18 provides a process that provides some guidance to municipal staff on information and inputs to help make decisions on what routes should be. I mean, it's true that we want all roads ideally to be better and improved for cycling infrastructure, and there is guidance in the book that speaks to that. When roads are improved or resurfaced, opportunities should be given to see what can be done to improve those. But on those components of a network that's been designated and approved by council, there's a process to go to sort of find the best route. So looking at cycling mode share, looking at population density, looking at areas where we think we can get more cycling trips, looking at equity, proximity to schools, and all these types of things come into place when we're doing this type of analysis in GIS. Next. So, an integrated cycling network really comes together as a number of layers. And as planners and designers and engineers, we think this way when we develop these plans. We don't just think about routes and facility types. We also think about implementation. We also think about users. So if you look at the graphic on the left, it sort of provides, and it may not be necessarily in the same order for you, but we talk about a recreational cycling network, which would be mostly off-road for people, a lower cycling network, which would be on local roads where we don't really have designated facilities. The speed might be posted at 40 or 30 kilometers an hour, and there's very little traffic. Then we talk about the more commuter spline networks on your collector and arterial roads that really require designated and ideally buffered or physically separated cycling infrastructure. We integrate that with road transit and pedestrian networks so that they are all connected, which is really important. And that in the design of cycling infrastructure, we also want to be careful that we take into account how pedestrians are accommodated and how cyclists and pedestrians sort of interface at intersections, because we're, as you all know, improving our pedestrian systems to make them more accessible. We want to make sure that as we build the cycling infrastructure that we don't conflict with that or don't add additional confusion to both pedestrians and cyclists on how they should interface at intersections and crossings. And then natural features are key components. We need to think about grades, green space, crossings of water courses, and other things. So when you take all those layers together, you end up with this multimodal sort of transportation network. And that's sort of the whole premise behind the updates into the planning component of OTM Book 18. And so this book is not just about design, it's about planning as well, which we think is really important. I am now going to pass the baton over to my esteemed colleague, Shawn Smith, who's going to take you through some of the design changes and highlights in the new OTM Book 18. So Shawn, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so section 4 focuses exclusively on linear cycling facility design, and there's an increased level of guidance from the original Book 18. Here are all of the facility types that are covered, and they're separated into 3 different categories. On the left column is the physically separated bikeways, which includes physically separated cycle lanes, cycle tracks, and in-boulevard multi-use paths. And then the middle column are the bicycle lanes on street, which include the conventional, buffered, and contraflow, or on one-way streets. And then the right column is the shared cycling facility type, which covers advisory bike lanes, a new type which I'll discuss in a few minutes, neighborhood bikeways, mixed traffic operation on quiet streets, and paved shoulders. So the new Book 18 also contains detailed guidance on different considerations and applications of separation techniques, such as curbs, planters, bollards. And you can see here that they vary in degree of protection, aesthetic value, and costs and other factors that need to be considered. There's also increased guidance on two-way cycling facilities for multi-use paths and cycle tracks. Key challenges for two-way facilities are that they are sometimes less intuitive, often have complex intersection designs, and can sometimes be difficult to accommodate cyclist queuing. But benefits, on the other hand, are reduced space requirements overall, ease of maintenance, because there's one facility instead of 2, and also a high degree of comfort. As I mentioned, advisory bike lanes are a new facility type used when a roadway is too narrow to accommodate both two-way traffic and traditional bike lanes at the same time. The typical application context is 30 to 50 kilometers per hour and less than 4,000 vehicles per day. Motorists move into the bike lane to avoid oncoming traffic, yielding to cyclists. And they can often be implemented in the same space as 2 shared lanes, but offer a traffic calming benefit as well as significant improvement in cyclist comfort when you compare it to, say, putting sharrows on the road. Okay, on to section 5, which is all about the facility selection process. And Book 18 still has the 3-step process. However, we've updated the tools that recommend physical separation at lower motor vehicle speed and volume thresholds. So some of you may be familiar with the facility selection nomograph from the original Book 18, which is shown on the left. And on the right is the updated version, and we've split it into the urban suburban on the top and the rural, for the rural context on the bottom. And then following step 1 is step 2 refines and confirms the facility type using the context and engineering judgment. And then step 3 of the process documents the design decision and rationale. So I'll delve into the nomographs a little bit further. So here is the urban suburban one. And the white space in the bottom left is the shared operating space. We've got traffic volume across the bottom axis, and then the posted speed limit on the left axis. So we're recommending 40 kilometers per hour maximum for shared streets in mixed traffic. And then you move into the light green space, which is the designated operating space, where we're recommending a maximum 50 kilometers per hour and up to 6,000 vehicles per day. And a big change, as Dave mentioned, is that conventional bike lanes are no longer recommended on multi-lane roads. So the minimum for, say, a 4-lane road would be a buffered bike lane, but preferably even going to a cycle track, depending on the context. And here is the rural nomograph. So again, starting in the bottom left with the shared operating space. So it's still appropriate, but on very low volume roadways and the lower speed limits. And then moving up to paved shoulders, when you get to about 3,000 vehicles per day and above 60 kilometers per hour as a minimum. And then at greater thresholds, 6,000 vehicles per day, recommending a buffer with the paved shoulder or a separate multi-use path beyond the clear zone of the roadway. So in step 2, we're refining the facility selection type. There's some new tools like these charts here, which help you, they take into account some of the traffic considerations or operating characteristics of the roadway and help you narrow down further based on the various factors. For example, the function of the roadway, the vehicle mix, pedestrian activity, frequency of intersections and crossings, on-street parking, and so on. Okay, so on to section 6, which is the biggest chapter in the new guide. It makes up about a third of the overall guide and covers things like adjacent and setback crossings, including protected intersections, driveway treatments, right turn channels. And there's also expanded guidance on mid-block crossings, roundabouts, grade separation, and so on. So there are lots of material. I'll just touch on some of the highlights today. Protected intersections are a relatively new design treatment in North America, and we wanted to understand how they compare to other more traditional intersection designs in various conflict scenarios. So we've developed a series of animations. In this example, you can see the perspective of a motorist looking through their car window, and when a cyclist would be in the motorist blind spot, represented by the orange triangle there. So we found that the sweet spot to have the cycling facility is set back 4 to 6 meters from the curb line. And this is consistent with other guidance that's available and best practices. The setback design prompts the driver to cross close to so the cyclist can be seen through the driver's side window. Yeah. So here's an example figure from Book 18 of that setback crossing with the protected corner. And some key features of the protected intersection are that setback crossing, as I mentioned, for the cyclist, 4 to 6 meters from the cross street, or the parallel street, I should say. And the corner refuge island, and an appropriate sized radius for that island that helps slow turning vehicles. And the forward bicycle queuing. So you could see that they get a head start from the motor vehicles when they get a green signal. So these can be implemented for cycle tracks or multi-use paths, but a bike lane can also ramp up into the intersection at the approach to and become a protected corner to cross an intersection, and then at the other side go back to road level. And here's an example of an adjacent crossing where it's typically requires less space than setback crossings. That's one of the advantages. It's adjacent to the motor vehicle lane. In this case, the figure, it drops down to road level, and the physical separation is maintained to the stop line. And there is a forward stop bar to improve visibility. Another consideration could be using signal phasing strategies like a leading bicycle interval, which would give the cyclist a head start green before the motorist. Okay, well, in addition to the protected corners, here are 4 design solutions for cyclists to make a left turn. So we've got the 2-stage queue boxes, both in Boulevard, which is the top left example and the one in the photo, and the on-street 2-stage queue box in the top right. And then there's also a jug handle or pocket design used at T intersections, and the bike box, where cyclists can go ahead of the motor vehicle lane at a red signal. There's more clarity in the new guide on conflict zone markings and the use of elephant's feet and dashed markings. So elephant's feet on the left, dashed markings on the right for on street. And also there's flexibility in the use of dashed green or solid green and how the green is applied. So it's really up to a municipality how they want to set their standard to use the green surface treatment. Yeah, so here are some figures on driveway treatments. We've got the low volume in the left columns and the high volume driveways on the right, where we're recommending green treatment across the driveway. And then the top row are on-street facilities, the bottom row are in boulevard facilities, so either multi-use path or cycle track. So the distinction is really between risk exposure, between the low volume and the high volume. Uncontrolled crossings where people ride bikes should be faced with either a stop sign or a yield sign. There are different treatments that can be done here. So center median refuge can help improve the safety and comfort of the crossing. So you can see that example on the right and also in the photo. And another alternative is to consider a raised crossing at the conflict point to encourage slower operating speed of motorists. Another consideration is to use an S-curve at the approach, which would help slow cyclists as they get to the crossing. Roundabouts are also covered in the new guide, so some great, very progressive information about this. So the recommendation is a radial roundabout design, which slows motorists at the entries and exits of the roundabouts, compared with tangential design, which encourages higher speeds. So design solutions we see here for single lane roundabouts, the 2 on the left, and a multi-lane roundabout on the right. With a PXO crossing, whereas the one in the middle is a motor vehicle priority, and pedestrians and cyclists wait for a gap. Traditional turn channels often feature a generous radius that allows turning motor vehicles to operate at relatively high speeds. So newer smart channels provide some improvement on this, reducing speeds and providing cyclist and pedestrian priority at the crossings. So here's an example of one that was recently built in Sudbury. We've also introduced a new marking for raised crossings, which is the triangle inside the triangle you can see in the photo, which is more common in the US, rather than one that's been used in the past in Ontario, where the triangle is turned the opposite way from the shark's teeth markings, which can be confusing to the average road user because they do mean different things, the yield markings and the raised crossings, but they can be confused. Active transportation bridges and tunnels may be implemented to provide connections across major barriers, bodies of water, highways, rail corridors. So the figure here shows the various pedestrian and cycling configurations, as well as the minimum widths and desired widths of these. Okay, so that's a quick overview. I know a lot of information on the crossings. So now I'll move on to section 7, which is other facility design treatments, like curbside management, which is shown in the photo there of a parking lay-by. There's some great information and new guidance on bus stop design and assessment of design options for various configurations. So there are 4 types of bus stops identified in the new guide: 2 physically separated and 2 with on street. You can see, I won't get into the details here, but here is the 4 options. So the island boarding transit stop in the top left is for a cycle track or multi-use path where it goes behind the transit stop, compared with the one on the top right where it's a shared zone going through the bus stop where pedestrians have and cyclists have to yield, depending on the amount of space and the configuration that is available and the constraints. And then the bottom 2, the curbside transit stop, where the bus pulls into the bike lane, and then where the bottom right is the lay-by transit stop, where the bus crosses the bike lane into a lay-by. There's a lot more guidance on accessibility-informed design, like tactile walking surface indicators at crossings, delineation for separating cyclist and pedestrian facilities, shown here. This is still a very evolving practice in Ontario, and but I feel like the new book is very progressive in the recommendations it includes. So you can see different types of separation between pedestrians and cyclists here with the beveled curb or tactile surface or planting zone. Section 8 is all about implementation, and still has the 5-phase process from the previous guide, but definitely expanded guidance. And we've also included some different types of cycling projects along with case studies, from pilot projects to retrofits to complete street transformations. So here are the steps. It covers from strategic planning to feasibility assessment and functional design, then on to preliminary and detailed design, construction, and post-completion phases, and all the steps in between. So here's an example of a project as what we call a road diet or a lane reconfiguration, where you're reallocating space available based on pavement markings and signage, and in this case, some bollards to provide protection. And so a good example of this is going from a 4-lane cross section to 3 lanes plus bike lanes. So you've got a center left turn lane, and using the same space available, but it makes it I guess, yeah, improves the roadway for all users and safety as well. Section 9 is all about support features. So end of trip facilities, cycling wayfinding. We've got bike parking here, various options for short-term and long-term bike storage, and also includes some amenities like bike repair stations and change facilities and so on. And cycling wayfinding is detailed as well. So consists of signs, pavement markings, or tools to orient the cyclists and guide them to their destinations along the network. And successful wayfinding can increase the use of bike facilities and improve the cycling experience as well. So it shouldn't be forgotten. And finally, Section 10 includes new content on maintenance strategies. So the minimum maintenance standards for Ontario, asset management, winter cycling networks, also more guidance on winter and non-winter maintenance activities. Yeah, I guess I'll end with 3 trivia questions. Guess can maybe put in the chat here where you think this one is. We can see who the first winner is. But this is an example of a protected intersection. Can anyone guess where this one is out of the choices on the screen there?
If you look very carefully at the photo, it'll give you a hint. Thanks, Ron.
Yes. Yeah, there we go. Ottawa is correct. Yes, this is an example from Ottawa. They were one of the first municipalities in Ontario. They were the first, I think, to build protected intersections, and it had been for a number of years. But now there are many municipalities across Ontario who have implemented them. So that's great to see, and there's more coming. How about this one? Is it London, Hamilton, Brampton, or Kingston? Anyone dare to take a guess? And this is an example of an island boarding transit stop. I see London is, and that is the correct answer, yes. And last one, is it Ottawa, Waterloo, Toronto, or Hamilton? I see Kayla and Chris have got the correct answer. Toronto it is. Yeah, this is Shaw Street, which was recently improved as a neighborhood bikeway. And this is an example of where cyclists have priority here, and cars have to take a longer route to get to their destination. So thank you, everyone. We will open up the floor for questions, and I think this provided an overview, highlights of the new Book 18. And once released later this fall, I think will be transformative, just as the original Book 18 was, leading to more consistent, higher quality cycling facilities in communities across Ontario. So we're really excited to be a part of it.
Thanks so much, Shawn and Dave. If anyone has any questions for our speakers today, you can type it in the chat box, or instead, if you'd like to use the hands up function, we can call on you. So the floor is open. We have about 20 minutes left for questions. So maybe I will start us off. I noticed that as you were going through your slides and the various sections and the updates to Book 18, there's quite a lot that's now common with other provinces across Canada. And given that WSP is an international organization, and Dave, you're in charge of communities and planning for municipalities across Canada, are there any key common messages that you share with other provinces as you're going through these processes?
That's a really good question. There's been a lot more collaboration between professionals, both at the municipal level and the consulting level across the country, and not just in Canada, but also with our colleagues in the United States, about lessons learned and what they're doing, because significant progress has been made on implementing cycling infrastructure in North America. We're still, trying to adapt and learn and apply principles that really work internationally as well. So, we are connecting with our colleagues in BC and Alberta and Quebec and other provinces that have their own guidelines. The geometric design guideline update in 2017 that the Transportation Association of Canada, or TAC, developed. It also did an extensive review of best practices across the country as it related to bikeway and pedestrian design, and that's captured in that updated manual. And when we developed OTM Book 18 early on, the actual initial assignment before we started getting into sort of updating the document was to research a number, I think there were like 10 or 12 specific issue areas that we were investigating. So for example, I see a comment or a question from Chris regarding any news about MTO and PXOs accommodating cyclists. That was one of the research areas that we explored. Can we, retrofit a PXO system similar to the ones that are set out in Ontario Traffic Manual Book 15 to accommodate a cross ride so that cyclists could trigger their signal, and then when cars stop, they could ride across. And so the answer so far is, even though we explored it and we think there is merit, the current book and the current legislation doesn't permit it. It is an issue and topic that we hope will be further researched in the coming years, and hopefully will make it into the next iteration of Book 18. So Chris, no, that currently isn't permitted in Ontario. If you cross at a crosswalk or a PXO, technically under law, you need to dismount and walk across. So I think that sort of captures that, Subha.
I would just add that MTO is open to working with municipalities on piloting different features that aren't in the book. So exploratory design features like accommodating cyclists better at PXOs. So that could be done as a pilot project if municipalities are interested in doing that.
Fabulous, thank you. And I see another question from Leonard. Is it preferred to have pedestrian crosswalks or cycling cross rides closest to parallel lanes through intersections?
So,
yeah, go ahead. No. Well, that's a tricky one. I think a lot of it depends on the context of the intersection. But in general, a setback does provide additional reaction time and gives cyclists and pedestrians a little bit of head start, but it can't be set back too far. If it's beyond the 6 meters, then the motorist is starting to accelerate as they make the turn, and it's and maybe they're too far. So there is that sweet spot of 4 to 6 meters. But if you don't have the space, an adjacent crossing does also work, and there are treatments that can be done to help improve the safety and comfort of those crossings too.
Another point related to that question is, how the facility of the cross ride is laid out at an intersection in terms of whether the cyclists are closer to the inside of the intersection or the pedestrians depends on the facility that's approaching the intersection. So if you have cycle tracks that are closest to the curb, then the cross ride will be designed that way. If you have a multi-use pathway or something else where it's on the far side, then it will be flipped over. So that guidance is in OTM book. And like Shawn mentioned, it is also related to the context of the intersection. The reality is, municipalities don't always have the resources or ability to acquire land if necessary to include, the ideal design at these intersections. So very often they have to adapt. And Book 18 provides some guidance on how to modify the preferred design solutions in the guide as best as possible to meet sort of the context at specific locations.
And I would also add that in addition to changing the geometry of the roadway, you could also consider signal phasing strategies, like giving a cyclist a protected signal phase, especially when you have a high volume of right turning vehicles. Protected signal phase can improve safety quite significantly.
There was a follow-up to that. What about MTO making on-ramp crossings safer compared to uncontrolled crossings currently. Any
So-
thoughts on that?
So Leonard, I think, who asked that question, it's one of the most challenging challenging issues we have is with interchange, especially park flow interchanges and free flow ramps. So, I mean, Book 18 and even MTO in many of their new or rehab interchange designs are trying to have those ramp terminals connected to traffic signals so that we can better facilitate crossings of pedestrians and cyclists. But the reality is there are still free flow ramps on occasion. There are different solutions. Shawn was very much involved in an interesting project in York Region along Highway 7, where as part of a transitway project, they actually moved the pedestrian and cycling facility into the center of the roadway over Highway 400 and avoided sort of going over those free flow ramps, which was a very interesting solution, but again, sort of a unique project. So there are different treatments. We talked to MTO about ideas like, pinching the ramp a little bit or raising it a little bit. But, those are always challenges in terms of, as you all know, cars, as they approach the interchange, they're actually accelerating sometimes. And we got to be really careful on the conflict between pedestrians and cyclists who cross. And we don't have a perfect solution to it, except by improving pavement markings and sight lines and signage and trying to sort of encourage motor vehicles through tighter curb radii where those ramps are so they can't move around quite as quick as they used to try to lower the speed differential between those who want to cross and those in cars who want to get on the highway or off the highway. So we're making progress, and Book 18, I think, demonstrates that, but we haven't solved it.
Yeah, and I'm seeing more examples now of where in an urban area, the ramps are normalized to a conventional intersection rather than having a free flow ramp. So that's becoming more common practice too.
So Chris asked a question about mixed cross rides. So mixed cross rides can be used at uncontrolled or stop controlled intersections, but shared or side by side are still the ones that are recommended at signalized intersections. And there was a minor change in that. There was a misinterpretation issue in the original Book 13 by MTO. So that was clarified in this update as it relates to mixed cross rides, which is a narrower sort of facility. Because you still need to accommodate a separate zone for pedestrians at signalized intersections as per the legislation. So that's been identified and discussed in the new book. Shawn, you want to take the next question?
Okay, will there be different recommendations between urban and rural mid-block crossings? Yeah, that's a tricky one. Whether there's a stop control or a yield control, there's a lot of discussion about that in the new guide. I do think it warrants a different approach when you consider rural versus urban. There's no one size fits all solution to that one. Dave, do you have anything to add on?
I don't think so. One of the things that we discussed when we were doing the research, especially in rural areas, if you remember earlier in Shawn's presentation, where he had presented some design options, one of them had sort of the bikeway or multi-use pathway as it approached the mid-block location. It actually sort of did a bit of a turn. And that's in part to slow cyclists down as they approach the intersection. It also, if you notice the way it was designed, it forced cyclists or pedestrians who are on the MEP to be facing oncoming traffic as they line up to cross, because that's the way the bend was designed. So we're trying everything to sort of get that sort of eye-to-eye look so that people are not just rushing across, but they're actually forced to look at oncoming traffic as they, at least for the first lane they cross. So, we're trying different things to try to improve those crossings. I think at high volume crossings, the idea of narrowing or adding additional trail crossing signs, both in advance and at the actual trail crossing sign, the yellow warning signs that are in the another book, as well as other features at the actual crossing. So if we're talking about, a major trail system, a popular trail system, those are important considerations. Also, if there are sightline issues on the approach to the mid-block crossing, that's something that really requires some specific consideration about, can you reduce speed? Can you do something that really is in the face of oncoming motorists, so they realize as they're coming around that they need to slow down and that cyclists and pedestrians may be crossing. So we do talk about that in book 18, but at the end of the day, very often you need to come up with design solutions that are really location specific.
Yeah, and one thing we stress is that for any uncontrolled crossings, there shouldn't be pavement markings on the road at that crossing, because it does set a false sense of security. But there is good guidance in OTM book 15, pedestrian crossings, on the hierarchy from signals to PXOs to wait for gap and so on.
So Ron's question about combined cross ride at a channel, yes, you can do that. And actually, somewhere in the book, there's a conversation about the facility type or the type of cross ride should relate to the kind of facility approaching. So if it's a multi-use pathway, no sidewalk, then it's already a combined facility. So it's likely a combined facility through the crossing makes more sense. While if it's a separated facility, like a bikeway or cycle track, whether one-way or two-way, and an adjacent sidewalk, then the side-by-side might be the best recommendation. Different municipalities have applied different approaches. I recall, I believe, Shawn, correct me if I'm wrong, that York Region's approach is to use the combined cross ride in all examples. Is that not true?
It is. That's what they've decided to do, yes.
Yeah.
But there are other municipalities where they're only using the separated. So,
right.
Yeah.
So Louise asked about the magic date. I really wish we could read MTO's mind. We ask this question of them regularly because we get asked regularly. All I can tell you is that, it's in the publication queue, that MTO has approved it for publication, and they are just waiting to get it through publication, and they will be releasing it as soon as they can. There are a number of updates to the Ontario Traffic Manual series that have been underway, and because of COVID and other reasons, I think things are sort of backed up. So it's unfortunate. We'd hoped that it would have been out by now, but we are still confident, knock on wood, that it will come out in this fall.
And we'll certainly tweet out the news that it's out when it's when it is released. You will hear about it, Louise.
Shawn, you want to take the next question? And then we'll wrap up?
Yes. So there is some guidance about the recommended buffers from the curb to the cycle track. And it depends on the speed of the road and whether it's a two-way or a one-way facility and some other factors like that. But in general, there should be a buffer. I think for one way, it's a minimum of 0.3, but desired is more than that. And for a two-way facility, there's a minimum buffer, I think, of 0.5.
Some municipalities, Shawn, who have tried to implement those in a constrained situation, constrained cross-section, what they've done is they've added a paint line on the cycle track directly behind the back of curb to try to reinforce the cyclist to stay away from that curb. Because the concern is we don't want them to get too close. It doesn't take much to sort of pivot around a few stones that they're trying to avoid, and then, by mistake, slip off and go off the curb into a live traffic lane. So the buffer is preferred, but if you can't do the buffer, then as a minimum, there should be some kind of visual treatment to try to encourage cyclists to stay away from the curb.
Right, or even provide a continuous barrier along that curb.
So I think that's it for questions. Subha, back to you.
Yes. So as we're wrapping this up today, as a public health researcher and a data person, I appreciate that throughout your presentations, you were talking about taking stock of what you have available, because you may not, you can't plan for multi-lanes if that space is simply not available, and you have to take into account vehicle volumes. I appreciate that you're talking about evidence-driven decisions for design. Throughout the update, are there specific recommendations of what to take stock of before diving into an implementation strategy? Just wondering if you could just close this session by just talking about what should you collect before you make your decisions?
So I'll start, and then Shawn, you can add in because I'm sure I'll miss a few things. So in the planning component, there's a whole exercise of data that is suggested that you look at, and you look at land use, you look at existing and future sort of built form that's envisioned for the corridor. You look at space constraints, you look at parking, whether there's on-street or off-street. Is there an option to reduce parking on one side of the road? You look at existing data in terms of speed. Ideally, is there collision, not ideally, but is there collision history information that you can assess to see what's happening along the road? Is it a transit corridor? Are there key destinations like grocery stores or other, high volume retail facilities or institutional facilities like schools and other things on a corridor? And how do we deal with that? Loading and unloading so we collect all that information early on just to understand how a street functions today and how it might function in the future if it's resurfaced or rehabbed, or if designated AT infrastructure is added. It's really important to think not short term here, but long term. So, some municipalities are seeing slow growth or change, and so they implement interim facilities that may not be the ultimate solution. So they may not do a deep dive into all that data, but it's a challenge too when you do these master plans too, but you don't always have access to all the information. But we always try our best to look at all the data and information that's available first and engage other stakeholders to see if they have any other information they can share with us that might allow us then to go through and start identifying candidate routes that could be part of the network. So we don't start with drawing lines on a map. We actually start with getting data and looking at it and looking at statistic candidate data and other information first to see what's logical. Because at the end of the day, we want to provide a network along corridors where we think the majority of people want to go, whether it be for recreation or for utilitarian purposes. And there may be road A that is perfectly fine for an AT facility and could be easily adapted. But the reality is the parallel road B is the one that everyone wants to go to because that's where the coffee shop is, the library, the pool, the rec center. And just because it's a busier road doesn't mean that that shouldn't be the right connection for the network.
Yeah, I would add that data is only good as what you do with it. So it's important to know why you're collecting the data, and is it because you have some measures of success that you want to evaluate? It is important to have a robust monitoring program. Often there are tweaks to the design after it's built to improve it, and so you may not get it right the first time, and it's important to collect that information. Even like just comparing before and after, like vehicle speeds, number of cyclists, all those types of things are a really important communication tool to build on for future projects. So I would strongly encourage municipalities to think about that at the beginning stages of a project.
One last comment, Subha. I know we have to wrap up, but I think it's important for everyone to hear that this is a guideline document. It's not prescriptive. It's very important that planners and engineers use this as a guideline to inform their decision-making. And a decision-making process is laid out in the book. So, the excuse that, well, it's not in the book, so we can't do it, isn't really an excuse anymore, because it's quite clear in the book that it doesn't have to be in the book necessarily to be the ultimate solution. But the book does give you information and a process to make the right decision for the right location. And it may be different than what, the desired guideline is, but, we would encourage everyone to try their best to at least avoid going below the minimum thresholds, the minimum dimensions that are in this book, because there are good reasons why we've set those.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dave. And if anyone on this call is looking for a place to start for collecting data on the engineering or the lay of the land with respect to cycling facilities, our BFC application form is quite comprehensive and gives you a good starting point to see what you have to work with. And then you can take a look at the updates to OTM Book 18 to see where you can go. What is the future of design possibilities? So thanks again, Shawn and Dave, for tuning in today. And thank you all for for sharing your lunch with us today. And the slides and recording of this webinar will be posted early next week. And we wish you all a wonderful rest of the day and weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.